"My darling Robert," said she, never doubting, "it is you, it is you." "Yes, little sister," said he, "it is I am here to save you all, but be very silent." "Brave lad," repeated Glenarvan. "Watch the savages outside," said Robert. Mulready, whose attention was distracted for a moment by the appearance of the boy, resumed his post. "It is all right," said he. "There are only 4 awake, the rest are asleep." A minute after, the hole was enlarged, and Robert passed from the arms of his sister to those of Lady Helena. Round his body was rolled a long coil of flax rope. My child," murmured Lady Helena, "the savages did not kill you." "No, madam," said he. "I do not know how it happened, but in the scuffle I got away. I jumped the barrier. For 2 days I hid in the bushes to try and see you. While the tribe were busy with the chief's funeral, I came and reconnoitered this side of the path, and I saw that I could get to you. I stole this knife and rope out of the desert hut. The tufts of bush and the branches made me a ladder, and I found a kind of grotto already hollowed out in the rock under this hut. I had only to bore some feet in soft earth, and here I am." 20 noiseless kisses were his reward. "Let us be off," said he, in a decided tone. "Is Paganel below?" asked Glenarvan. "Monsieur Paganel," replied the boy, amazed. "Yes, is he waiting for us?" "No, my lord, but is he not here?" inquired Robert. "No, Robert," answered Mary Grant. "Why, have you not seen him?" asked Glenarvan. "Did you lose each other in the confusion? Did you not get away together?" "No, my lord," said Robert, taken aback by the disappearance of his friend Paganel. "Well, lose no more time," said the major. "Wherever Paganel is, he cannot be in worse plight than ourselves. Let us go." Truly, the moments were precious. They had to fly. The escape was not very difficult, except the 20 feet of perpendicular fall outside the grotto. After that, the slope was practicable to the foot of the mountain. From this point, the prisoners could soon gain the lower valleys, while the Maoris, if they perceived the flight of the prisoners, would have to make a long round to catch them, being unaware of the gallery between the Weratwa and the outer rock. The escape was commenced, and every precaution was taken. The captives passed one by one through the narrow passage into the grotto. John Mangles, before leaving the hut, disposed of all the evidences of their work, and in his turn slipped through the opening and let down over it the mats of the house, so that the entrance to the gallery was quite concealed. The next thing was to descend the vertical wall to the slope below, and this would have been impracticable, but that Robert had brought the flax rope, which was now unrolled and fixed to a projecting point of rock, the end hanging over. John Mangles, before his friends trusted themselves to this flax rope, tried it. He did not think it very strong, and it was of importance not to risk themselves imprudently, as a fall would be fatal. "This rope," said he, "will only bear the weight of 2 persons, therefore let us go in rotation. Lord and Lady Glenarvan first. When they arrive at the bottom, 3 pulls at the rope will be a signal to us to follow." "I will go first," said Robert. "I discovered a deep hollow at the foot of the slope where those who come down can conceal themselves and wait for the rest." "Go, my boy," said Glenarvan, pressing Robert's hand. Robert disappeared through the opening out of the grotto. A minute after, the 3 pulls at the cord informed them the boy had alighted safely. Glenarvan and Lady Helena immediately ventured out of the grotto. The darkness was still very great, though some grayish streaks were already visible on the eastern summits. The biting cold of the morning revived the poor young lady. She felt stronger and commenced her perilous descent. Glenarvan first, then Lady Helena, let themselves down along the rope, till they came to the spot where the perpendicular wall met the top of the slope. Then Glenarvan, going first and supporting his wife, began to descend backward. He felt for the tufts and grass and shrubs able to afford a foothold, tried them, and then placed Lady Helena's foot on them. Some birds, suddenly awakened, flew away, uttering feeble cries, and the fugitives trembled when a stone loosened from its bed rolled to the foot of the mountain. They had reached halfway down the slope, when a voice was heard from the opening of the grotto. "Stop," whispered John Mangles. Glenarvan, holding with one hand to a tuft of tetragonia, with the other holding his wife, waited with breathless anxiety. Wilson had had an alarm. Having heard some unusual noise outside the Weratwa, he went back into the hut and watched the Maoris from behind the mat. At a sign from him, John stopped Glenarvan. One of the warriors on guard, startled by an unusual sound, rose and drew nearer to the Weratwa. He stood still about 2 paces from the hut and listened with his head bent forward. He remained in that attitude for a minute that seemed an hour, his ear intent, his eye peering into the darkness. Then, shaking his head like one who sees he is mistaken, he went back to his companions, took an armful of dead wood, and threw it into the smoldering fire, which immediately revived. His face was lighted up by the flame, and was free from any look of doubt, and after having glanced to where the first light of dawn whitened the eastern sky, stretched himself near the fire to warm his stiffened limbs. "All's well," whispered Wilson. John signaled to Glenarvan to resume his descent. Glenarvan let himself gently down the slope. Soon Lady Helena and he landed on the narrow track where Robert waited for them. The rope was shaken 3 times, and in his turn John Mangles, preceding Mary Grant, followed in the dangerous route. He arrived safely. He rejoined Lord and Lady Glenarvan in the hollow mentioned by Robert. 5 minutes after, all the fugitives had safely escaped from the Weratwa, left their retreat, and keeping away from the inhabited shores of the lakes, they plunged by narrow paths into the recesses of the mountains. They walked quickly, trying to avoid the points where they might be seen from the paw. They were quite silent and glided among the bushes like shadows. Whither? Where chance led them, but at any rate they were free. Toward 5 o'clock, the day began to dawn. Bluish clouds marbled the upper stratum of clouds. The misty summits began to pierce the morning mists. The orb of day was soon to appear, and instead of giving the signal for their execution, would, on the contrary, announce their flight. It was of vital importance that before the decisive moment arrived they should put themselves beyond the reach of the savages, so as to put them off their track. But their progress was slow, for the paths were steep. Lady Glenarvan climbed the slopes, supported, not to say carried, by Glenarvan, and Mary Grant leaned on the arm of John Mangles. Robert, radiant with joy, triumphant at his success, led the march, and the 2 sailors brought up the rear. Another half an hour, and the glorious sun would rise out of the mists of the horizon. For half an hour the fugitives walked on as chance led them. Paganel was not there to take the lead. He was now the object of their anxiety, and whose absence was a black shadow between them and their happiness. But they bore steadily eastward, as much as possible, and faced the gorgeous morning light. Soon they had reached a height of 500 feet above Lake Taupo, and the cold of the morning, increased by the altitude, was very keen. Dim outlines of hills and mountains rose behind one another, but Glenarvan only thought how best to get lost among them. Time enough by and by to see about escaping from the labyrinth. At last the sun appeared and sent his first rays on their path. Suddenly a terrific yell from 100 throats rent the air. It came from the paw, whose direction Glenarvan did not know. Besides, a thick veil of fog, which, spread at his feet, prevented any distinct view of the valleys below. But the fugitives could not doubt that their escape had been discovered, and now the question was, would they be able to elude pursuit? Had they been seen? Would not their track betray them? At this moment the fog in the valley lifted, and enveloped them for a moment in a damp mist, and at 300 feet below they perceived the swarming mass of frantic natives. While they looked they were seen. Renewed howls broke forth, mingled with the barking of dogs, and the whole tribe, after vainly trying to scale the rock of Weratwa, rushed out of the paw, and hastened by the shortest paths in pursuit of the prisoners who were flying from their vengeance. Chapter 13: The Sacred Mountain. The summit of the mountain was still 100 feet above them. The fugitives were anxious to reach it that they might continue their flight on the eastern slope, out of the view of their pursuers. They hoped then to find some practicable ridge that would allow of a passage to the neighboring peaks that were thrown together in an orographic maze, to which poor Paganel's genius would doubtless have found the clue. They hastened up the slope, spurred on by the loud cries that drew nearer and nearer. The avenging crowd had already reached the foot of the mountain. "Courage, my friends!" cried Glenarvan, urging his companions by voice and look. In less than 5 minutes they were at the top of the mountain, and then they turned to judge of their position and decide on a route that would baffle their pursuers. From their elevated position they could see over Lake Taupo, which stretched toward the west in its setting of picturesque mountains. On the north the peaks of Pyrangia, on the south the burning crater of Tongariro, but eastward nothing but the rocky barrier of peaks and ridges that formed the Wahiti Ranges, the great chain whose unbroken links stretch from the East Cape to Cook's Straits. They had no alternative but to descend the opposite slope and enter the narrow gorges, uncertain whether any outlet existed. Glenarvan could not prolong the halt for a moment. Wearied as they might be, they must fly or be discovered. "Let us go down," cried he, "before our passage is cut off." But just as the ladies had risen with a despairing effort, McNab stopped them and said, "Glenarvan, it is useless, look." And then they all perceived the inexplicable change that had taken place in the movements of the Maoris. Their pursuit had suddenly stopped. The ascent of the mountain had ceased by an imperious command. The natives had paused in their career and surged like the sea waves against an opposing rock. All the crowd, thirsting for blood, stood at the foot of the mountain yelling and gesticulating, brandishing guns and hatchets, but not advancing a foot. Their dogs, rooted to the spot like themselves, barked with rage. What stayed them? What occult power controlled these savages? The fugitives looked without understanding, fearing lest the charm that enchained Kaikumu's tribe should be broken. Suddenly, John Mangles uttered an exclamation which attracted the attention of his companions. He pointed to a little enclosure on the summit of the cone. "The tomb of Karatit," said Robert. "Are you sure, Robert?" said Glenarvan. "Yes, my lord, it is the tomb. I recognize it." Robert was right. 50 feet above, at the extreme peak of the mountain, freshly painted posts formed a small palisaded enclosure, and Glenarvan too was convinced that it was the chief's burial place. The chances of their flight had led them to the crest of Maunganamu. Glenarvan, followed by the rest, climbed to the foot of the tomb. A large opening, covered with mats, led into it. Glenarvan was about to invade the sanctity of the Audupa when he reeled backward. "A savage," said he. "In the tomb?" inquired the major. "Yes, McNabbs." "No matter, go in." Glenarvan, the major, Robert, and John Mangles entered. There sat a Maori, wrapped in a large flax mat, the darkness of the Audupa preventing them from distinguishing his features. He was very quiet and was eating his breakfast quite coolly. Glenarvan was about to speak to him when the native forestalled him by saying gaily and in good English, "Sit down, my lord, breakfast is ready." It was Paganel. At the sound of his voice they all rushed into the Audupa, and he was cordially embraced all round. Paganel was found again. He was their salvation. They wanted to question him, to know how and why he was here on the summit of Maunganamu, but Glenarvan stopped this misplaced curiosity. "The savages," said he. "The savages," said Paganel, shrugging his shoulders. "I have a contempt for those people. Come and look at them." They all followed Paganel out of the Audupa. The Maoris were still in the same position round the base of the mountain, uttering fearful cries. "Shout, yell till your lungs are gone, stupid wretches," said Paganel. "I dare you to come here." "But why?" said Glenarvan. "Because the chief is buried here, and the tomb protects us, because the mountain is tabooed." "Tabooed?" "Yes, my friends, and that is why I took refuge here, as the malefactors used to flee to the sanctuaries in the Middle Ages." "God be praised," said Lady Helena, lifting her hands to heaven. The fugitives were not yet out of danger, but they had a moment's respite, which was very welcome in their exhausted state. Glenarvan was too much overcome to speak, and the major nodded his head with an air of perfect content. "And now, my friends," said Paganel, "if these brutes think to exercise their patience on us, they are mistaken. In 2 days we shall be out of their reach." "By flight," said Glenarvan, "but how?" "That I do not know," answered Paganel, "but we shall manage it." And now everybody wanted to know about their friend's adventures. They were puzzled by the reserve of a man generally so talkative. On this occasion, they had to drag the words out of his mouth. Usually he was a ready storyteller. Now he gave only evasive answers to the questions of the rest. "Paganel is another man," thought McNabbs. His face was really altered. He wrapped himself closely in his great flax mat and seemed to deprecate observation. Everyone noticed his embarrassment when he was the subject of conversation, though nobody appeared to remark it. When other topics were under discussion, Paganel resumed his usual gaiety. Of his adventures, all that could be extracted from him at this time was as follows. After the murder of Karatit, Paganel took advantage, like Robert, of the commotion among the natives, and got out of the enclosure. But less fortunate than young Grant, he walked straight into a Maori camp, where he met a tall, intelligent-looking chief, evidently of higher rank than all the warriors of his tribe. The chief spoke excellent English, and he saluted the newcomer by rubbing the end of his nose against the end of the geographer's nose. Paganel wondered whether he was to consider himself a prisoner or not, but perceiving that he could not stir without the polite escort of the chief, he soon made up his mind on that point. This chief, Hihai, or Sunbeam, was not a bad fellow. Paganel's spectacles and telescope seemed to give him a great idea of Paganel's importance, and he manifested great attachment to him, not only by kindness but by a strong flax rope, especially at night. This lasted for 3 days. To the inquiry whether he was well treated, he said yes and no, without further answer. He was a prisoner, and except that he expected immediate execution, his state seemed to him no better than that in which he had left his unfortunate friends. One night, however, he managed to break his rope and escape. He had seen from afar the burial of the chief, and knew that he was buried on the top of Maunganamu, and he was well acquainted with the fact that the mountain would be therefore tabooed. He resolved to take refuge there, being unwilling to leave the region where his companions were in durance. He succeeded in his dangerous attempt, and had arrived the previous night at the tomb of Karatit, and there proposed to recruit his strength while he waited in the hope that his friends might, by divine mercy, find the means of escape. Such was Paganel's story. Did he designedly conceal some incident of his captivity? More than once his embarrassment led them to that conclusion. But however that might be, he was heartily congratulated on all sides. And then the present emergency came on for serious discussion. The natives dare not climb Maunganamu, but they, of course, calculated that hunger and thirst would restore them their prey. It was only a question of time, and patience is one of the virtues of all savages. Glenarvan was fully alive to the difficulty, but made up his mind to watch for an opportunity, or make one. First of all, he made a thorough survey of Maunganamu, their present fortress, not for the purpose of defense but of escape. The Major, John, Robert, Paganel, and himself made an exact map of the mountain. They noted the direction, outlet, and inclination of the paths. The ridge, a mile in length, which united Maunganamu to the Wahiti chain, had a downward inclination. Its slope, narrow and jagged though it was, appeared the only practicable route if they made good their escape at all. If they could do this without observation, under cover of night, they might possibly reach the deep valleys of the range and put the Maoris off the scent. But there were dangers in this route. The last part of it was within pistol shot of natives posted on the lower slopes. Already when they ventured on the exposed part of the crest, they were saluted with a hail of shot which did not reach them. Some gun wads, carried by the wind, fell beside them. They were made of printed paper, which Paganel picked up out of curiosity, and with some trouble deciphered. "That is a good idea. My friends, do you know what those creatures use for wads?" "No, Paganel," said Glenarvan. "Pages of the Bible. If that is the use they make of the holy book, I pity the missionaries. It will be rather difficult to establish a Maori library." "And what text of scripture did they aim at us?" "A message from God himself," exclaimed John Mangles, who was in the act of reading the scorched fragment of paper. "It bids us hope in him," added the young captain, firm in the faith of his Scotch convictions. "Read it, John," said Glenarvan. And John read what the powder had left visible. "I will deliver him, for he hath trusted in me." "My friends," said Glenarvan, "we must carry these words of hope to our dear, brave ladies. The sound will bring comfort to their hearts." Glenarvan and his companions hastened up the steep path to the cone, and went toward the tomb. As they climbed, they were astonished to perceive every few moments a kind of vibration in the soil. It was not a movement like earthquake, but that peculiar tremor that affects the metal of a boiler under high pressure. It was clear the mountain was the outer covering of a body of vapor, the product of subterranean fires. This phenomenon, of course, excited no surprise in those that had just traveled among the hot springs of the Waikato. They knew that the central region of the Ikanomani is essentially volcanic. It is a sieve, whose interstices furnish a passage for the Earth's vapors in the shape of boiling geysers and solfataras. Paganel, who had already noticed this, called the attention of his friends to the volcanic nature of the mountain. The peak of Maunganamu was only one of the many cones which bristle on this part of the island. It was a volcano of the future. A slight mechanical change would produce a crater of eruption in these slopes, which consisted merely of whitish silicious tufa. "That may be," said Glenarvan, But we are in no more danger here than standing by the boiler of the Duncan. This solid crust is like sheet iron. I agree with you, added the major, but however good a boiler may be, it bursts at last after too long service. McNabbs, said Paganel, I have no fancy for staying on the cone. When Providence points out a way, I will go at once. I wish, remarked John, that Maunganamu could carry us himself, with all the motive power that he has inside. It is too bad that millions of horsepower should lie under our feet unavailable for our needs. Our Duncan would carry us to the end of the world with the thousandth part of it. The recollections of the Duncan, evoked by John Mangles, turned Glenarvan's thoughts into their saddest channel. For desperate as his own case was, he often forgot it, in vain regret at the fate of his crew. His mind still dwelt on it when he reached the summit of Maunganamu and met his companions in misfortune. Lady Helena, when she saw Glenarvan, came forward to meet him. Dear Edward, said she, you have made up your mind, are we to hope or fear? Hope, my dear Helena, replied Glenarvan. The natives will never set foot on the mountain, and we shall have time to devise a plan of escape. More than that, madam, God himself has encouraged us to hope. And so saying, John Mangles handed to Lady Helena the fragment of paper on which was legible the sacred words. And these young women, whose trusting hearts were always open to observe providential interpositions, read in these words an indisputable sign of salvation. And now let us go to the Audupa, cried Paganel in his gayest mood. It is our castle, our dining room, our study. None can meddle with us there. Ladies, allow me to do the honors of this charming abode. They followed Paganel, and when the savages saw them profaning anew the tabooed burial place, they renewed their fire and their fearful yells, the one as loud as the other. But fortunately the balls fell short of our friends, though the cries reached them. Lady Helena, Mary Grant, and their companions were quite relieved to find that the Maoris were more dominated by superstition than by anger, and they entered the monument. It was a palisade made of red-painted posts. Symbolic figures, tattooed on the wood, set forth the rank and achievements of the deceased. Strings of amulets, made of shells or cut stones, hung from one part to another. In the interior, the ground was carpeted with green leaves, and in the middle, a slight mound betokened the place of the newly made grave. There lay the chief's weapons, his guns loaded and capped, his spear, his splendid axe of green jade, with a supply of powder and ball for the happy hunting grounds. Quite an arsenal, said Paganel, of which we shall make a better use. What ideas they have, fancy carrying arms in the other world. Well, said the major, but these are English firearms. No doubt, replied Glenarvan, and it is a very unwise practice to give firearms to savages. They turn them against the invaders, naturally enough. But at any rate, they will be very valuable to us. Yes, said Paganel, but what is more useful still is the food and water provided for Karateet. Things had been handsomely done for the deceased chief. The amount of provisions denoted their esteem for the departed. There was food enough to sustain 10 persons for 15 days, or the dead man forever. The vegetable aliments consisted of edible ferns, sweet potatoes, the convolvulus batatas, which was indigenous, and the potato which had been imported long before by the Europeans. Large jars contained pure water, and a dozen baskets artistically plated contained tablets of an unknown green gum. The fugitives were therefore provided for some days against hunger and thirst, and they needed no persuasion to begin their attack on the deceased chief's stores. Glenarvan brought out the necessary quantity and put them into Albinet's hands. The steward, who never could forget his routine ideas, even in the most exceptional circumstances, thought the meal a slender one. He did not know how to prepare the roots and, besides, had no fire. But Paganel soon solved the difficulty by recommending him to bury his fern roots and sweet potatoes in the soil. The temperature of the surface stratum was very high, and a thermometer plunged into the soil would have marked fro to 170 degrees. In fact, Albinet narrowly missed being scalded, for just as he had scooped a hole for the roots, a jet of vapor sprang up and with a whistling sound rose 6 feet above the ground. The steward fell back in terror. "Shut off steam," cried the major, running to close the hole with the loose drift, while Paganel, pondering on the singular phenomenon, muttered to himself. "Let me see, why not?" "Are you hurt?" inquired McNabbs of Albinet. "No, Major," said the steward, "but I did not expect that Providence would send you fire. interrupted Paganel in a jovial tone. First the larder of Karatit and then fire out of the ground. Upon my word, this mountain is a paradise. I propose that we found a colony and cultivate the soil and settle here for life. We shall be the Robinsons of Maunganamu. We should want for nothing. If it is solid ground, said John Mangles. Well, it is not a thing of yesterday, said Paganel. It has stood against the internal fire for many a day, and will do so till we leave it at any rate. Breakfast is ready, announced Albinett with as much dignity as if he was in Malcolm Castle. Without delay, the fugitives sat down near the palisade, and began one of the many meals with which Providence had supplied them in critical circumstances. Nobody was inclined to be fastidious, but opinions were divided as regarded the edible fern. Some thought the flavor sweet and agreeable, others pronounced it leathery, insipid, and resembling the taste of gum. The sweet potatoes, cooked in the burning soil, were excellent. The geographer remarked that Karatit was not badly off after all. And now that their hunger was appeased, it was time to decide on their plan of escape. "So soon," exclaimed Paganel in a piteous tone. "Would you quit the home of delight so soon?" "But, Monsieur Paganel," interposed Lady Helena, "if this be Capua, you dare not intend to imitate Hannibal." "Madam, I dare not contradict you, and if discussion is the order of the day, let it proceed." "First," said Glenarvan, "I think we ought to start before we are driven to it by hunger. We are revived now, and ought to take advantage of it. Tonight we will try to reach the eastern valleys by crossing the cordon of natives under cover of the darkness." "Excellent," answered Paganel, "if the Maoris allow us to pass." "And if not?" asked John Mangles. "Then we will use our great resources," said Paganel. "But have we great resources?" inquired the Major. "More than we can use," replied Paganel without any further explanation. And then they waited for the night. The natives had not stirred. Their numbers seemed even greater, perhaps owing to the influx of the stragglers of the tribe. Fires lighted at intervals formed a girdle of flame round the base of the mountain, so that when darkness fell, Maunganamu appeared to rise out of a great brazier, and to hide its head in the thick darkness. 500 feet below they could hear the hum and the cries of the enemy's camp. At 9 o'clock, the darkness being very intense, Glenarvan and John Mangles went out to reconnoiter before embarking the whole party on this critical journey. They made the descent noiselessly, and after about 10 minutes, arrived on the narrow ridge that crossed the native lines, 50 feet above the camp. All went well so far. The Maoris, stretched beside the fires, did not appear to observe the two fugitives, but in an instant a double fusillade burst forth from both sides of the ridge. "Back!" exclaimed Glenarvan. "Those wretches have the eyes of cats and the guns of riflemen." And they turned, and once more climbed the steep slope of the mountain, and then hastened to their friends, who had been alarmed at the firing. Glenarvan's hat was pierced by 2 balls, and they concluded that it was out of the question to venture again on the ridge between 2 lines of marksmen. "Wait till tomorrow," said Paganel, "and as we cannot elude their vigilance, let me try my hand on them." The night was cold, but happily Karatit had been furnished with his best night gear, and the party wrapped themselves each in a warm flax mantle, and protected by native superstition, slept quietly inside the enclosure, on the warm ground, still violating with the violence of the internal ebullition. Chapter 14: A Bold Stratagem. Next day, February 17th, the sun's first rays awoke the sleepers of the Maunganamu. The Maoris had long since been astir, coming and going at the foot of the mountain, without leaving their line of observation. Furious clamor broke out when they saw the Europeans leave the sacred place they had profaned. Each of the party glanced first at the neighboring mountains, and at the deep valleys still drowned in mist, and over Lake Taupo, which the morning breeze ruffled slightly. And then all clustered round Paganel, eager to hear his project. Paganel soon satisfied their curiosity. "My friends," said he, "my plan has one great recommendation. If it does not accomplish all that I anticipate, we shall be no worse off than we are at present. But it will succeed." "And what is it?" asked McNabbs. "It is this," replied Paganel. "The superstition of the natives has made this mountain a refuge for us, and we must take advantage of their superstition to escape. If I can persuade Kai Kumu that we have expiated our profanation, that the wrath of the deity has fallen on us, in a word, that we have died a terrible death, Do you think he will leave the plateau of Maunganamu to return to his village? Not a doubt of it, said Glenarvan. And what is the horrible death you refer to? Asked Lady Helena. The death of the sacrilegious, my friends, replied Paganel. The avenging flames are under our feet. Let us open a way for them. What, make a volcano? Cried John Mangles. Yes, an impromptu volcano, whose fury we can regulate. There are plenty of vapors ready to hand, and subterranean fires ready to issue forth. We can have an eruption ready to order. An excellent idea, Paganel, well conceived, said the Major. You understand, replied the geographer. We are to pretend to fall victims to the flames of the Mare Pluto, and to disappear spiritually into the tomb of Karatit, and stay there 3, 4, even 5 days if necessary. That is to say, till the savages are convinced that we have perished and abandon their watch. But, said Miss Grant, suppose they wish to be sure of our punishment and climb up here to see. No, my dear Mary, returned Paganel. They will not do that. The mountain is tabooed, and if it devoured its sacrilegious intruders, it would only be more inviolably tabooed. It is really a very clever plan, said Glenarvan. There is only one chance against it. That is, if the savages prolong their watch at the foot of Maunganamu, we may run short of provisions. But if we play our game well, there is not much fear of that. And when shall we try this last chance? Asked Lady Helena. Tonight, rejoined Paganel, when the darkness is the deepest. Agreed, said McNabbs. Paganel, you are a genius, and I, who seldom get up in enthusiasm, I answer for the success of your plan. Oh, those villains, they shall have a little miracle that will put off their conversion for another century. I hope the missionaries will forgive us. The project of Paganel was therefore adopted, and certainly with the superstitious ideas of the Maoris, there seemed good ground for hope. But brilliant as the idea might be, the difficulty was in the modus operandi. The volcano might devour the bold schemers, who offered it a crater. Could they control and direct the eruption when they had succeeded in letting loose its vapor and flames and lava streams? The entire cone might be engulfed. It was meddling with phenomena of which nature herself has the absolute monopoly. Paganel had thought of all this, but he intended to act prudently and without pushing things to extremes. An appearance would be enough to dupe the Maoris, and there was no need for the terrible realities of an eruption. How long that day seemed! Each one of the party inwardly counted the hours. All was made ready for flight. The Audupa provisions were divided and formed very portable packets. Some mats and firearms completed their light equipment, all of which they took from the tomb of the chief. It is needless to say that their preparations were made within the enclosure, and that they were unseen by the savages. At 6 o'clock the steward served up a refreshing meal. Where or when they would eat in the valleys of the ranges no one could foretell, so that they had to take in supplies for the future. The principal dish was composed of half a dozen rats, caught by Wilson and stewed. Lady Helena and Mary Grant obstinately refused to taste this game, which is highly esteemed by the natives, but the men enjoyed it like the real Maoris. The meat was excellent and savory, and the 6 devourers were devoured down to the bones. The evening twilight came on. The sun went down in a stormy-looking bank of clouds. A few flashes of lightning glanced across the horizon, and distant thunder pealed through the darkened sky. Paganel welcomed the storm, which was a valuable aid to his plans, and completed his program. The savages are superstitiously affected by the great phenomena of nature. The New Zealanders think that thunder is the angry voice of Nuyatwa, and lightning the fierce gleam of his eyes. Thus their deity was coming personally to chastise the violators of the taboo. At 8 o'clock, the summit of the Maunganamu was lost in portentous darkness. The sky would supply a black background for the blaze which Paganel was about to throw on it. The Maoris could no longer see their prisoners, and this was the moment for action. Speed was necessary. Glenarvan, Paganel, McNabbs, Robert, the steward, and the 2 sailors all lent a hand. The spot for the crater was chosen 30 paces from Karatit's tomb. It was important to keep the Audupa intact, for if it disappeared, the taboo of the mountain would be nullified. At the spot mentioned, Paganel had noticed an enormous block of stone, round which the vapors played with a certain degree of intensity. This block covered a small natural crater hollowed in the cone, and by its own weight prevented the egress of the subterranean fire. If they could move it from its socket, the vapors and the lava would issue by the disencumbered opening. The workers used as levers some posts taken from the interior of the Audupa, and they plied their tools vigorously against the rocky mass. Under their united efforts, the stones soon moved. They made a little trench so that it might roll down the inclined plane. As they gradually raised it, the vibrations underfoot became more distinct. Dull roarings of flame and the whistling sound of a furnace ran along under the thin crust. The intrepid laborers, veritable cyclops handling Earth's fires, worked in silence. Soon some fissures and jets of steam warned them that their place was growing dangerous. But a crowning effort moved the mass, which rolled down and disappeared. Immediately the thin crust gave way. A column of fire rushed to the sky with loud detonations, while streams of boiling water and lava flowed toward the native camp and the lower valleys. All the cone trembled, as if it was about to plunge into a fathomless gulf. Glenarvan and his companions had barely time to get out of the way. They fled to the enclosure of the Audupa, not without having been sprinkled with water at 220 degrees. This water at first spread a smell like soup, which soon changed into a strong odor of sulfur. Then the mud, the lava, the volcanic stones, all spouted forth in a torrent. Streams of fire furrowed the sides of Maunganamu. The neighboring mountains were lit up by the glare. The dark valleys were also filled with dazzling light. All the savages had risen, howling under the pain inflicted by the burning lava, which was bubbling and foaming in the midst of their camp. Those whom the liquid fire had not touched fled to the surrounding hills, then turned and gazed in terror at this fearful phenomenon, this volcano in which the anger of their deity would swallow up the profane intruders on the sacred mountain. Now and then, when the roar of the eruption became less violent, their cry was heard. Taboo, taboo, taboo. An enormous quantity of vapors, heated stones, and lava was escaping by this crater of Maunganamu. It was not a mere geyser like those that girdle round Mount Hekla, in Iceland. It was itself a Hekla. All this volcanic commotion was confined, till then, in the envelope of the cone, because the safety valve of Tongariro was enough for its expansion. But when this new issue was afforded, it rushed forth fiercely. And by the laws of equilibrium, the other eruptions in the island must on that night have lost their usual intensity. An hour after this volcano burst upon the world, broad streams of lava were running down its sides. Legions of rats came out of their holes and fled from the scene. All night long, and fanned by the tempest in the upper sky, the crater never ceased to pour forth its torrents with a violence that alarmed Glenarvan. The eruption was breaking away the edges of the opening. The prisoners, hidden behind the enclosure of stakes, watched the fearful progress of the phenomenon. Morning came. The fury of the volcano had not slackened. Thick yellowish fumes were mixed with the flames. The lava torrents wound their serpentine course in every direction. Glenarvan watched with a beating heart, looking from all the interstices of the palisaded enclosure, and observed the movements in the native camp. The Maoris had fled to the neighboring ledges, out of the reach of the volcano. Some corpses which lay at the foot of the cone were charred by the fire. Further off toward the Pa, the lava had reached a group of 20 huts which were still smoking. The Maoris, forming here in their groups, contemplated the canopied summit of Maunganamu with religious awe. Kaikumu approached in the midst of his warriors, and Glenarvan recognized him. The chief advanced to the foot of the hill, on the side untouched by the lava, but he did not ascend the first ledge. Standing there with his arms stretched out like an exerciser, he made some grimaces, whose meaning was obvious to the prisoners. As Paganel had foreseen, Kaikumu launched on the avenging mountain a more rigorous taboo. Soon after, the natives left their positions and followed the winding paths that led toward the Pa. "They are going," exclaimed Glenarvan. "They have left their posts. God be praised, our stratagem has succeeded. My dear Lady Helena, my brave friends, we are all dead and buried. But this evening when night comes, we shall rise and leave our tomb and fly these barbarous tribes." It would be difficult to conceive of the joy that pervaded the Audupa. Hope had regained the mastery in all hearts. The intrepid travelers forgot the past, forgot the future, to enjoy the present delight. And yet the task before them was not an easy one, to gain some European outpost in the midst of this unknown country. But Kaikumu once off their track, they thought themselves safe from all the savages in New Zealand. A whole day had to elapse before they could make a start, and they employed it in arranging a plan of flight. Paganel had treasured up his map of New Zealand, and on it could trace out the best roads. After discussion, the fugitives resolved to make for the Bay of Plenty, towards the east. The region was unknown, but apparently desert. The travelers, who from their past experience had learned to make light of physical difficulties, feared nothing but meeting Maoris. At any cost, they wanted to avoid them and gain the east coast, where the missionaries had several stations. That part of the country had hitherto escaped the horrors of war, and the natives were not in the habit of scouring the country. As to the distance that separated Lake Taupo from the Bay of Plenty, they calculated it about 100 miles. 10 days, march at 10 miles a day, could be done, not without fatigue, but none of the party gave that a thought. If they could only reach the mission stations, they could rest there while waiting for a favorable opportunity to get to Auckland, for that was the point they desired to reach. This question settled, they resumed their watch of the native proceedings, and continued so doing till evening fell. Not a solitary native remained at the foot of the mountain, and when darkness set in over the Taupo valleys, not a fire indicated the presence of the Maoris at the base. The road was free. At 9 o'clock, the night being unusually dark, Glenarvan gave the order to start. His companions and he, armed and equipped at the expense of Karatit, began cautiously to descend the slopes of Maunganamu, John Mangles and Wilson leading the way, eyes and ears on the alert. They stopped at the slightest sound, they started at every passing cloud. They slid rather than walked down the spur, that their figures might be lost in the dark mass of the mountain. At 200 feet below the summit, John Mangles and his sailors reached the dangerous ridge that had been so obstinately defended by the natives. If by ill luck the Maoris, more cunning than the fugitives, had only pretended to retreat, if they were not really duped by the volcanic phenomenon, this was the spot where their presence would be betrayed. Glenarvan could not but shudder, in spite of his confidence, and in spite of the jokes of Paganel. The fate of the whole party would hang in the balance for the 10 minutes required to pass along that ridge. He felt the beating of Lady Helena's heart as she clung to his arm. He had no thought of turning back. Neither had John. The young captain, followed closely by the whole party and protected by the intense darkness, crept along the ridge, stopping when some loose stone rolled to the bottom. If the savages were still in the ambush below, these unusual sounds might provoke from both sides a dangerous fusillade. But speed was impossible in their serpent-like progress down this sloping crest. When John Mangles had reached the lowest point, he was scarcely 25 feet from the plateau, where the natives were encamped the night before, and then the ridge rose again pretty steeply toward a wood for about a quarter of a mile. All this lower part was crossed without molestation, and they commenced the ascent in silence. The clump of bush was invisible, though they knew it was there, and but for the possibility of an ambush, Glenarvan counted on being safe when the party arrived at that point. But he observed that after this point, they were no longer protected by the taboo. The ascending ridge belonged not to Maunganamu, but to the mountain system of the eastern side of Lake Taupo, so that they had not only pistol shots but hand-to-hand fighting to fear. For 10 minutes, the little band ascended by insensible degrees toward the higher tableland. John could not discern the dark wood, but he knew it ought to be within 200 feet. Suddenly he stopped, almost retreated. He fancied he heard something in the darkness. His stoppage interrupted the march of those behind. He remained motionless long enough to alarm his companions. They waited with unspeakable anxiety, wondering if they were doomed to retrace their steps and return to the summit of Maunganamu. But John, finding that the noise was not repeated, resumed the ascent of the narrow path of the ridge. Soon they perceived the shadowy outline of the wood showing faintly through the darkness. A few steps more and they were hid from sight in the thick foliage of the trees. Chapter 15, From Peril to Safety. The night favored their escape, and prudence urged them to lose no time in getting away from the fatal neighborhood of Lake Taupo. Paganel took the post of leader, and his wonderful instinct shone out anew in this difficult mountain journey. His nyctalopia was a great advantage, his cat-like sight enabling him to distinguish the smallest object in the deepest gloom. For 3 hours they walked on without halting along the far-reaching slope of the eastern side. Paganel kept a little to the southeast, in order to make use of a narrow passage between the Kaimanawa and the Wahiti ranges, through which the road from Hawke's Bay to Auckland passes. Once through that gorge, his plan was to keep off the road, and, under the shelter of the high ranges, march to the coast across the inhabited regions of the province. At 9 o'clock in the morning, they had made 12 miles in 12 hours. The courageous women could not be pressed further, and, besides, the locality was suitable for camping. The fugitives had reached the pass that separates the two chains. Paganel, map in hand, made a loop toward the northeast, and at 10 o'clock the little party reached a sort of redan, formed by a projecting rock. The provisions were brought out, and justice was done to their meal. Mary Grant and the Major, who had not thought highly of the edible fern till then, now ate of it heartily. The halt lasted till 2 o'clock in the afternoon, then they resumed their journey. And in the evening they stopped 8 miles from the mountains, and required no persuasion to sleep in the open air. Next day was one of serious difficulties. Their route lay across this wondrous region of volcanic lakes, geysers, and solfataras, which extended to the east of the Wahidi Ranges. It is a country more pleasant for the eye to ramble over than for the limbs. Every quarter of a mile they had to turn aside or go around for some obstacle, and thus incurred great fatigue. But what a strange sight met their eyes! What infinite variety nature lavishes on her great panoramas! On this vast extent of 20 miles square, the subterranean forces had a field for the display of all their varied effects. Salt springs, of singular transparency, peopled by myriads of insects, sprang up from thickets of tea tree scrub. They diffused a powerful odor of burnt powder, and scattered on the ground a white sediment like dazzling snow. The limpid waters were nearly at boiling point, while some neighboring springs spread out like sheets of glass. Gigantic tree ferns grew beside them, in conditions analogous to those of the Silurian vegetation. On every side jets of water rose like park fountains, out of a sea of vapor, some of them continuous, others intermittent, as if a capricious Pluto controlled their movements. They rose like an amphitheater on natural terraces, their waters gradually flowed together under folds of white smoke, and corroding the edges of the semi-transparent steps of this gigantic staircase. They fed whole lakes with their boiling torrents.